The call came at 0317, and by the time Sergeant First Class Renata Voss reached the hangar, the C-17 was already on the ground, with 3 of its 4 engines still running. She had been asleep for maybe 90 minutes. It didn't matter. Renata pulled her jacket tighter against the Nevada desert cold and ducked under the wing as the loadmaster waved her through. The rear ramp was already down. Inside, under harsh white light, a man was strapped to a litter with 2 combat medics, kneeling on either side of him, their hands moving in the concentrated, mechanical way of people who had long since stopped being scared and started just working. She recognized one of the medics. He looked up when he heard her boots on the ramp. "Doc Voss," he said, not a greeting. A relief. Renata was not a doctor. She held no medical degree, no license, no credentials that would mean anything in a civilian hospital. What she held was 11 years of surgical field experience across 3 combat deployments, a classified certification that did not appear on any resume, and hands that had not shaken under pressure since she was 24 years old. She crouched beside the litter and looked at the patient. The man's name was Colonel Harwick. She didn't know that yet. She only knew what she could see. Male, late 50s, labored breathing, pallor that said internal, not external, and a blood pressure reading on the medic's monitor that made her jaw tighten. "How long?" she asked. 42 minutes since the bleed started. "We've been managing, but..." The medic hesitated. "He's not stabilizing. Where's the surgical team? That's why we called you, Sergeant." Renata looked at the man on the litter for a long, steady moment. Then she stood up and started rolling up her sleeves. The base's forward surgical unit was a converted maintenance bay at the edge of the tarmac, 3 prefab walls and 1 permanent one, lit by 4 overhead panels that buzzed faintly when the generator cycled. It was not a proper operating room. It had never been designed to be one. But Renata had worked in worse. A bombed-out schoolhouse in Kandahar, the back of a striker, moving at 40 miles per hour, once memorably, a shipping container in the Djibouti heat with instruments she'd sterilized herself using a camp stove and a prayer. She had the patient on the table and was already gloved when the doors opened and Brigadier General Marcus Thorne walked in. She knew who he was immediately. You didn't spend 11 years in the army without learning to read rank insignia in your peripheral vision. 2 stars. The kind of man who entered rooms and expected them to reorganize around him. Behind him were 3 aides, none of them medical. "Who authorized this?" Thorne said. Renata did not look up from the patient. "Sir, I need you to step back from the sterile field. I'm asking who authorized a non-commissioned officer to perform surgery on a full-bird colonel." "Major Delaney authorized it. He's the senior medical officer on this base tonight." She held out her hand toward the scrub tech, a young specialist named Obi, who had worked with her twice before and knew to stay focused. "Retractor." Obi placed it in her hand. "Delaney doesn't have the authority to authorize this," Thorne said. He moved closer, not toward the table but into the room, filling it with his presence the way generals were trained to do. "We have a trauma surgeon on staff, Dr. Elias Renner. Get him!" "Dr. Renner is in surgery in Bay 2. He went in 40 minutes ago and he cannot be pulled." "Sir," she said the last word cleanly, without effect. "Then we wait." Renata finally looked up. She looked at Thorne over the patient's chest and the slow, insistent beeping of the monitor. She looked at him with the kind of calm that is not peace but is something harder than peace, the stillness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. "With respect, General," she said, "this man has a splenic laceration, and he is losing approximately 200 milliliters of blood every 4 minutes. Dr. Renner's current surgery is a minimum of another 90 minutes. If we wait, Colonel Harwick dies on this table." She paused. "I'm not going to let that happen." Silence. The monitor beeped. Thorne stared at her, with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being spoken to this way by anyone, let alone by a woman who looked, to his eye, barely old enough to have finished basic training. Renata Voss had a face that did her no favors rooms like this one. She was 31 but looked younger under the surgical lights. She was slight, brown-haired, with the kind of quiet features people forgot immediately after meeting her. She looked like someone's daughter. She looked like someone's assistant. She did not look like what she was. "Get her out of here," Thorne said to one of his aides. The aide took a step forward. "Touch me," Renata said, without raising her voice, "and I will have you charged with interfering in a medical emergency. That's a court-martial offense." She held the aide's gaze until he stopped moving. Then she looked back at Thorne. "General, I understand your concern. But right now, I am the most qualified person in this room to keep Colonel Harwick alive, and every second we spend having this conversation is a second his blood pressure drops. So you can file whatever report you need to file in the morning, and I will answer every question. But right now I need you to step outside." Thorne did not move. "Please," she said, not begging. It was the kind of please that meant, "I have said everything reasonable, and now the next move is yours." The monitor's tone changed. Obi glanced at the screen and looked at Renata. She was already moving. "Step outside, General," she said again, and this time, she was not looking at him at all, because the patient had just become the only thing in the room that mattered, and Thorne's presence or absence was now entirely his own problem to solve. She heard the door after about 30 seconds. It might have been a minute. She wasn't counting anymore. The splenic laceration was a grade 3. Manageable, if you caught it. The kind of injury that killed people not because it was immediately catastrophic, but because it was persistent, a slow, relentless drain that the body fought until it couldn't. She had seen it before. She had seen what happened when it was caught late, and what happened when it wasn't. She worked without speaking except to call for instruments. Obi was steady. That mattered more than people understood. A scrub tech who panicked could cost you 15 seconds reaching for the wrong thing. And 15 seconds was sometimes everything. She had once told a class of combat medics that the most important trait in a surgical assistant was not skill but rhythm. The ability to match your pace to someone else's without being asked. Obi had that. She didn't know where he'd gotten it, and she'd never asked. The bleeding was controlled at the 40-minute mark. She closed carefully, methodically, in the order she always closed. The order she'd been taught by a former Army trauma surgeon who had retired to a small practice in Bozeman and was now, as far as she knew, seeing nothing more dramatic than broken wrists and ski injuries. She thought about him sometimes when she worked. She thought about the long afternoons in that forward hospital in Helmand when he had stood behind her shoulder and said nothing, which was how she had learned to trust what her hands already knew. The last suture went in at 0539. She straightened up. Her back ached. Her feet ached. She was aware of both things distantly, the way you are aware of weather through a window. "Vitals," she said. Obi read them off. Better. Marably better. Not out of the woods, but moving in the right direction with something like momentum. She pulled her gloves off and set them on the tray and stood for a moment in the particular quiet that follows something difficult. The quiet that isn't rest, but is the body's acknowledgement that the worst has passed. Then she went to find General Thorne. He was in the corridor outside, standing with his aides in the way of men who have been made to wait and resented every second of it. When she came through the door, he turned toward her with an expression that was already prepared, already set, already certain of what it was going to say. "Sir," she said, "Colonel Harwick is stable. The laceration is repaired. He'll need monitoring through the morning, but barring complication, he will make a full recovery." A beat. Something moved through Thorne's expression. It was not gratitude. It was more complicated than that, more uncomfortable. The expression of a man recalibrating, which was not something men like him did naturally or well. "I want a full report," he said. "Yes, sir. You'll have it by 0800. I want to know your qualifications, your certifications, your training record. Of course! I want to know who cleared you for surgical procedure and what authority that clearance rests on. I'll include all of it." She met his eyes. "Sir, may I ask, is there a reason you were personally present for Colonel Harwick's transport tonight?" The question landed quietly, but it landed. Thorne looked at her for a moment. "He's a personal friend." "I see." She nodded. "Then I hope it helps to know that your friend is going to be fine." She turned to go. "Sergeant." She stopped. "Your name," he said. "Not an order. Something else. Something slightly less than an order." "Voss, sir. Renata Voss." She walked back toward the surgical bay to check on her patient, and behind her, she heard the sound of a general standing in a corridor with nothing left to say. The report she filed at 0800 was thorough. It included her certifications, which were numerous, her training record, which was extensive, and her authorization from Major Delaney, which was properly documented. What the report did not include, because it was classified at a level that Thorne's security clearance did not reach, was the full record of what Renata Voss had actually done, and where and under whose command. That record existed in a single secure file maintained by an office whose name appeared nowhere in public documentation. It described 11 years of service that looked, from the outside, like a series of unremarkable rotations and logistics postings. What it actually described was something else entirely. Renata had joined the army at 20 years old, which was not unusual. What was unusual was what had happened in the 18 months after her basic training, when she had been selected for a program whose existence was not acknowledged in any official capacity. The program trained individuals in a range of skills that were useful in environments where specialized personnel were not available, which is a careful way of saying that it trained people to do extraordinary things in terrible places with whatever was at hand. Surgical technique had been one component of that training. Not the only one, but the one that had, over time, come define her. She had performed field surgery in 4 countries. She had done it under fire, in darkness, without adequate supplies, on patients who were not supposed to be where they were, attended by personnel who officially weren't there either. She had lost patients. That was the part that no record captured. The ones she hadn't been able to save, the specific weight of each loss, which she still carried in the way you carry something that has no physical form but takes up space anyway. She was 31 years old, and she had been doing this for 11 years, and she was very, very tired. But Colonel Harwick was alive. That was the arithmetic that mattered. The complications arrived on the second day, and they were not medical. Thorne had filed a formal complaint with the base commander, a colonel named Ferris, alleging that Sergeant Voss had exceeded her authority and performed a medical procedure without appropriate credentials. The complaint was accurate in every technical sense. It was also the kind of thing that could end a career, even an unusual one, even one like hers. Ferris called her into his office at 1400. He was a careful man, the kind who read documents before meetings, which she appreciated, and who looked at you when you spoke, which she also appreciated. He had a framed photograph behind his desk. 3 kids, a dog, somewhere green and wet, the Pacific Northwest maybe, and he looked like the kind of person who went home to that photograph whenever he could and was grateful every time. "Sergeant Voss," he said, "I'm going to ask you to explain to me, in plain language, why I shouldn't be processing a formal reprimand right now, because Colonel Harwick is alive," she said. "That's not a legal argument." "No, sir, it isn't. The legal argument is that Major Delaney authorized the procedure, that my certifications cover the technique I used, and that the doctrine of medical necessity applied under the circumstances." She paused. "But the plain language answer is that Colonel Harwick is alive, and he would not be if I hadn't operated." Ferris looked at her. "Thorne says you defied a direct order. General Thorne told me to stop. I made a clinical judgment that stopping would result in the patient's death. I documented that judgment in real time. I stand by it. He also says you threatened one of his aides. I informed the aide that physically removing a surgeon from an active medical procedure constituted interference in a medical emergency." She kept her voice level. "That's a statement of fact, not a threat." Ferris was quiet for a moment. He looked at the file in front of him. Some of it he could read, and some of it he couldn't. The classified portions were blacked out, and from the way his eyes moved across the page, she could see him noticing the blocks of black text and making calculations about what they might mean. "Tell me something," he said. "Off the record, sir. How many times have you done this before?" She considered the question. "Enough," she said, "to know when it's going to work." Ferris closed the file. He looked out the window for a moment, the tarmac, the distant mountains, the flat white sky. "Thorne has a lot of pull," he said. "I know. He can make this very difficult for you. I know that too. Is there anything in your record that would help me help you? She thought about the classified file. She thought about what was in it and what it meant and who had access to it, and she thought about a phone call she had not made yet, but could make. There might be, she said. Give me 24 hours. She made the call from the parking lot of the PX at 1600, standing between a pickup truck and an SUV, with a faded bumper sticker that said "Somewhere in Texas," watching a sparrow pick at a candy wrapper on the asphalt. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years said, "Voss." "Colonel Marsh," she said. "I heard what happened. Then you know why I'm calling." A pause. The colonel, retired now, but the kind of retired that meant something different in their world, made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Harwick," he said. "I know him. Knew him from Bagram. Good man. He's going to make it. I know. I got the medical report 20 minutes ago." Another pause. "What do you need?" Thorne filed a complaint. "My CO is trying to protect me, but Thorne has the rank to make it stick." "What do you know about Thorne?" It was an interesting question, asked in a way that suggested Marsh already knew the answer and was curious whether she did too. She thought about the moment Thorne had entered the surgical bay, the way he'd positioned himself, the 3 aides, none of them medical. The fact that he had personally traveled with a colonel who was, she'd since learned, not part of his command, not in his chain, not someone who had any obvious reason to be on the same transport. "I know," he said. "Harwick was a personal friend," she said carefully. "He's more than that." Marsh's voice shifted, not lower exactly, but more deliberate. "Harwick has been working with JAG for the last 8 months on a procurement investigation, internal. Very quiet. Thorne's name has come up." She was quiet for a moment. "So Thorne was on that transport," she said. "Yes, and Harwick ended up with a splenic laceration. The injury was consistent with blunt impact sustained during an undocumented altercation aboard the aircraft." Marsh paused. "That's what the physical evidence review is going to show. The review that's going to happen now that Harwick is alive and awake and has spoken to the JAG officer who's been waiting very patiently at Landstuhl." She looked at the sparrow. It had abandoned the candy wrapper and was now sitting on the bumper of the truck, perfectly still, looking at something she couldn't see. "He was going to let him die," she said. "That's one interpretation. It's the right one." "Probably," Marsh said, "which is why it's going to matter, legally and officially, that Colonel Harwick did not die, and that the person responsible for that outcome is on record, with documentation, with a clear chain of authorization." He paused. "You are on record, Voss." "I am. Then I think you'll find that Thorne's clinical complaint has a short shelf life. A beat. I'm going to make some calls. You'll know by morning." She stood in the parking lot for a long time after she hung up, looking at the mountains going dark at the edges in the late afternoon light. The air smelled like dust and jet fuel. The smell she had lived inside. For so long, it had stopped registering as a smell and become simply the texture of the world. Colonel Harwick was alive. General Thorne had filed a complaint that was going to collapse under the weight of what Harwick knew. And Renata Voss was still, despite everything, the kind of tired that sleep did not touch. But she had learned a long time ago that there were 2 kinds of tired. There was the tired that came from doing something wrong, from carrying something you shouldn't be carrying. And there was the tired that came from doing something right, from spending yourself completely on something that mattered. The second kind, she had found, was livable. Thorne's complaint was formally withdrawn 4 days later. She was not told the reason officially. She did not need to be. She had been in the army long enough to read the silence between official statements, to understand what a withdrawal without explanation meant, and who had made it happen. What she did receive, officially, was a letter. It came through normal channels, unsealed, typed on plain paper with no letterhead, which was itself a kind of letterhead for people who knew what to look for. It was 3 sentences. "Colonel Harwick sends his regards. He says he remembers very little of that night, but he has been told what you did. He wanted you to know that his daughter just turned 7, and she has a father because of you." Renata read the letter once, standing in the hallway, outside her quarters in the early morning, before reveille, in the particular stillness of a base that had not yet woken up. She folded it carefully. put it in the left breast pocket of her jacket. She stood there for another moment, alone in the hallway in the quiet. Then she went to work. 6 weeks later, she was called into Colonel Ferris's office for a second time. This time, he was smiling, which was unusual enough that she noticed it immediately. "Sit down, Sergeant," he said. She sat. He pushed a document across the desk. She looked at it. It was a citation. She read it. It was formal, precise Army language, the kind of language that stripped the specific human texture from events and rendered them in clean, functional terms, which she had always found both frustrating and, in its own way, honest. What it said, in those clean and functional terms, was that Sergeant First Class Renata Voss had demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment in a medical emergency under adverse conditions, had preserved the life of a senior officer when no other qualified personnel were available, and had upheld the highest traditions of the United States Army. She read it twice. "There's more," Ferris said. She looked up. "Effective next month, you'll be transitioning to a new posting. The details are classified at this stage, but," he paused, "let's say the people who know what you can actually do have decided it's time to use it more deliberately." She was quiet for a moment. "And General Thorne?" she said. Ferris's expression shifted very slightly. "General Thorne has requested a reassignment. Requested. That's the official language. Yes." She nodded. She looked at the citation on the desk for another moment. She thought about Colonel Harwick's 7-year-old daughter. She thought about Obi, the scrub tech, who had been steady when steadiness mattered. She thought about the long cold walk from the barracks to that hangar at 0317, the 3 engines still running, the medic looking up and saying "Doc Voss," like it was a breath he'd been holding. She thought about all the years that had looked, from the outside, like nothing. The quiet postings, the unremarkable assignments, the face that people forgot immediately after meeting her. She picked up the pen on Ferris's desk and signed where he indicated. "Thank you, sir," she said. She meant it. She walked out of his office into the bright, flat Nevada morning. The tarmac, the distant mountains, the smell of dust and jet fuel, and she thought that she had always known in some precise and wordless part of herself that the work mattered even when no one was watching, even when no one knew. Even when the record was classified and the credit went nowhere and the only evidence of what she'd done was a patient who went home. That had always been enough. It still was.